January 1888. The northern Dakota prairie sits locked under 2 feet of packed snow when the carpenter takes his last look at what Britta Voss has built and says the only thing a man with 20 years of frontier building experience can say. That thing will kill you. He's not being cruel, he means it. He has framed 47 structures across 3 territories. He has watched a February gust pull a claim shanty 4 feet off its foundation in less than a minute. He knows every way the prairie wind breaks things. And this angular, steep-pitched structure Britta has spent 8 weeks assembling from salvaged rail ties and rough-cut pine makes no sense to him by any measure he knows. The roof rises at an angle so steep it looks almost like a wall. The walls slope inward to meet a central ridgepole 30 inches above a floor that barely fits a stove, a cot, and a wooden trunk. The whole thing, seen from the road, looks like an upended wagon, like something a child would draw if you asked them to sketch a house and then forgot to add the sides. 3 other carpenters agreed with him. So did 12 neighbours. So did the hardware man who sold her the nails, the postmaster, and the Norwegian pastor from the Lutheran church at Clear Lake, who stopped his horse on the way past and just stared. On the morning of the 12th of January, 1888, a warm front had settled over Dakota territory. Temperatures reached into the low 40s. Men left their coats on pegs. Children walked to school without scarves. It was the kind of January morning that makes you think the worst has already passed. At noon, the sky turned yellow-grey, then green at the edges. What came next rearranged everything those carpenters thought they knew about wind and roofs and the physics of surviving a Dakota winter. The storm that hit in the early afternoon of January 12 dropped the temperature at Yankton 18 degrees in 3 minutes. Not 18 degrees over an hour. 3 minutes. Fort Assiniboine in Montana recorded negative 55 degrees before it was done. The wind hit 60 miles per hour and held there through the night. 235 people died across the Dakotas and Nebraska, most of them in the first few hours, most of them outdoors, most of them caught between one building and another in a whiteout, so complete that men froze to death 12 feet from their own front doors. Britta Voss was inside her ridiculous triangle house. She was warm. The stove burned 6 pieces of wood that night. 6. Her neighbours burned through entire wood piles and were still cold by morning. The Johansson family, 3/4 of a mile west, burned everything combustible. They owned a chair, 2 fence posts, half a wooden crate, and kept the interior temperature in their frame shanty at 19 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind found every gap, every thin spot in the tar paper, every crack between green boards that had shrunk half an inch since October. Britta's place held 61 degrees through the whole night. This isn't a story about luck, it's a story about geometry, and what wind actually does when it hits a surface at different angles, and why every conventional instinct, those carpenters had instincts that were honestly not unreasonable given what they'd been taught, pointed them directly toward the wrong answer. To understand what Britta built, you need to understand what everyone else built and why. Swede County, Dakota Territory, in 1887, was a settlement that had arrived with spectacular speed and then immediately got stuck in the awkward middle stage between trail camp and actual town. The Northern Pacific Rail line had pushed through 3 years earlier, and behind it came the settlers, Scandinavians mostly, some Germans, a cluster of families from Ohio who'd heard the land was flat and good and cheap. The land was certainly flat, and it was cheap because the winters were the kind that killed livestock in closed barns. Standard construction on the Dakota prairie in 1887 followed rules that had evolved through brutal trial and error over about 2 decades of settlement. You built low. You built tight. You faced the front of your house away from the prevailing northwest wind. You used the cheapest available materials, and on a treeless prairie where you had to ship lumber by rail and pay railroad prices for every board, cheap meant thin. The most common shelter was what settlers called a claim shanty. It was, at its most basic, a frame of 2x4s covered in one layer of 1-inch boards, then a layer of tar paper, then a second layer of boards on top of the paper. A single skin of material between you and the Dakota winter. The roof was typically low-pitched, 4 inches of rise for every 12 inches of run, what carpenters call a 4/12 pitch. Some shanties had the curved, arched roofs that John Hudson, who studied this systematically 50 years later, described as looking like the top half of a barrel, chosen because settlers believed a curved surface deflected wind better than a flat one. The walls on these shanties were maybe R1, 25. That's the thermal resistance of 1 inch of pine board, barely more than a thin blanket held up by nails. The roof was worse. A single layer of board, a sheet of tar paper, and then whatever snow drifted onto it. Settlers who could afford it added a second layer of paper or stuffed the gap between inner and outer boards with sawdust or hay. Most couldn't. What nobody on the prairie fully reckoned with was what the wind did to a roof of that shape. When wind hits a flat or shallow-pitched roof at 60 miles per hour, it doesn't simply press down on it. The airflow separates at the windward edge of the roof, meaning it lifts off the roof surface and creates a zone of rapidly moving air just above it. Fast-moving air has low pressure. Slow-moving air has high pressure. The air inside the building is at higher pressure than the air rushing over the low-pitched roof above. That pressure difference acts like a hand pressing upward against the underside of every board. Engineers call this uplift. The ASCE 7 standard, the engineering code that governs American structural design, assigns a negative pressure coefficient of around 0.9 to a flat or low-pitched windward roof surface, meaning the wind is actively pulling it upward with a force of about 7.4 pounds per square foot in a 60 mile per hour wind. 7.5 pounds per square foot across a 20 by 20 foot roof is 3,000 pounds of upward force. The nails holding those boards down were not designed for 3,000 pounds of tension. They were driven by men who were cold and tired and had 3 more buildings to frame before November. They held in compression, meaning they were fine as long as something was pressing down on them. Upward pull was a different matter entirely. This is exactly what happened on January 12. The storm stripped the sod roof off Minnie Freeman's schoolhouse near Ord, Nebraska. It tore tar paper from walls across the territory. In Dodge County, Nebraska, an 8-foot section of roof boards lifted off a claim shanty in the first hour of the storm and became debris, cartwheeling across the snow until it hit a fence post. What kept most structures standing was not their design, it was luck, and the mass of accumulated snow on top, and the fact that many of them were drifted in on the windward side by the time the worst gusts hit. Put a 4-5 degree roof on that building. The same wind hitting a 4-5 degree windward slope does something entirely different. At that angle, the airflow doesn't separate, it stays attached to the sloped surface and follows it upward over the ridge. The pressure on the windward slope becomes positive, meaning it pushes down rather than pulling up. ASCE 7 assigns a positive pressure coefficient of about 0.4 to a 4-5 degree windward slope, which at 60 miles per hour translates to a downward force of roughly 4 pounds per square foot. The total swing between a flat roof and a 4-5 degree roof in a 60 mile per hour wind is about 11.5 pounds per square foot. That's the difference between wind ripping your roof upward and wind pressing your roof down. Every nail that was once under tension pulling outward is now under compression pushing inward. Wood handles compression loads far better than tension loads. The whole structural logic reverses. There's a second advantage the steep pitch provides, which is more immediately visible. A 4/12 roof in a Dakota blizzard accumulates snow. Wind-driven snow in a prairie blizzard is not the light powder you brush off a coat. It's dense, compacted, often wet on the bottom where it meets the roof surface, 15 to 25 pounds per cubic foot. 2 feet of wind-packed snow on a 20 by 20 foot roof is about 800 pounds. 4 feet, which happened in multi-day storms, is 1,600 pounds. The claim shanty framing wasn't built for 1,600 pounds of sustained load. A 4-5 degree pitched roof retains roughly 60% of the snow that falls on a flat roof. A steeper pitch, 55 or 60 degrees, retains around 25%. The snow that doesn't stay slides off the windward slope and piles against the base of the building, which creates, accidentally, a third advantage. A berm of packed snow 3 feet high around the foundation is one of the most effective windbreaks available. Snow has an R value of about 1 per inch. 3 feet of packed snow around your base is R36 at ground level, where the wind is most destructive. And the fourth advantage, the one that nobody talks about because the numbers are counterintuitive, is heat loss. The standard box frame claim shanty had roughly 1,040 square feet of exterior surface, excluding the floor. That surface lost heat at a rate controlled by the thin R1 25 walls and even thinner roof. In a 90-degree temperature differential, which is exactly what a Dakota January provides, 60 degrees inside against -30. Outside, that shanty was losing around 30,000 British thermal units per hour through its walls and roof. A small cast iron stove running hard could produce 15,000 to 20,000 British thermal units per hour at full burn with dry hardwood. The math did not work, which is why settlers went through wood at terrifying rates and still woke to frozen water barrels in the morning. A steep-pitched structure of equivalent floor area has about 30% less exterior surface. Less surface means less heat loss, regardless of insulation quality. In the same temperature differential, that structure loses around 18,000 British thermal units per hour. That's close to what a small stove can produce. Instead of chasing an impossible deficit all night, burning wood faster than the stove could be stoked, a steep-pitched structure on a normal output fire could reach something close to thermal equilibrium by midnight. This is not theoretical. Britta burned 6 pieces of wood. 6. She was 29 years old in the fall of 1887. She had arrived in Dakota Territory from Telemark, Norway, 8 years earlier with her parents and her older brother Torkel, who had filed on a quarter section in Swede County and built the family claim shanty while their father was sick with a lung complaint that killed him before the following spring. Her mother had lasted another 2 winters. Britta had nursed her through both of them, burning wood and hauling water from the creek a quarter mile from the house, watching the snow drift under the door and pile against the inside walls until she had to shovel it out in the mornings. Henrik Voss, no relation, had arrived in 1884, filed on a neighbouring quarter section, and married her in June of 1885. He was a capable man with large hands and a sensible disposition. He knew how to frame a building and how to judge timber quality, and how to run a plough through dense sod without breaking the blade. He had no illusions about the prairie. He'd read the promoter literature, the advertisements that called Dakota Territory the best agricultural land on earth, and mentioned average winter temperatures that bore no relationship to actual conditions, and ignored all of it. He built wide eaves, banked sod around the base of his shanty every October, and always put up 3 cords more wood than he thought he'd need. He died in September of 1887. Fever, likely typhoid, from the shallow well, though nobody put a name to it at the time. He went from walking the field to unconscious in 6 days and was buried before October. Britta was left with 160 acres of claim land, a frame shanty with R1, 25 walls, 11 cords of cut wood, $18, and the knowledge that winter was coming in 8 weeks. She was not a carpenter. She had watched Henrik work, and she had watched her brother work, and she had an understanding of how buildings went together that was largely observational and almost entirely untested. What she had, more precisely, was a memory. In Telemark, the region of south-central Norway where she'd grown up through age 14, the old farm structures were not built with the low-profile logic of the Dakota prairie. The traditional Norwegian storehouse, a stabber, sat on a high-pitched roof that could clear a winter's worth of snowfall. The main farmhouse, the stew, had a roof pitch steep enough that a man standing at the eave could barely reach the ridge without a ladder. She had carried this image in her memory for 15 years without ever thinking of it as useful engineering knowledge. It was simply what houses looked like when she was small. The frame shanty Henrik had built was already deteriorating. The green lumber he'd used cut from boards that had dried too fast and too unevenly after the mill had shrunk and split. There were gaps between boards wide enough to see daylight through. The previous winter, she had stuffed those gaps with strips of newspaper soaked in linseed oil. It helped, not enough. She made a decision in late October that the Carpenters would have advised against. She would not spend the winter in Henrik's shanty. She would build something new with the salvage materials available, rail ties that had been discarded along the NP line, rough-cut pine boards from a failed outbuilding on the neighbouring claim, the 12 good windows she'd saved from the old homestead before it burned in a grass fire the previous spring. She had $18 and 11 cords of wood and a memory of what Norwegian farmhouses looked like in a mountain winter. She started with the ridge pole. What Britta built was not an A-frame in any architectural sense. Modern A-frames first formalized by designer R.M. Schindler in California in 1934 and popularized in ski country after the 1950s, have walls that slope from the roof all the way to the ground with no vertical framing at all. What she built was closer to a steeply gabled structure, vertical end walls, but with a roof pitched so steeply, roughly 55 to 60 degrees by later estimation, that it dominated the appearance of the whole building. From a distance, the sloped surfaces were so prominent and the vertical end walls so short that it read as triangular. She started from what she knew how to do, which was to put up 2 end walls and attach a ridge pole between them. The end walls went up first vertical stud framing, conventional enough, except that she made them only 4 feet tall. Henrik's shanty walls had been 8 feet. The carpenters, who later critiqued her work, pointed to the 4-foot walls as proof of incompetence. Why would you build walls you couldn't stand upright inside? She would explain. If anyone had asked seriously rather than rhetorically that you could stand upright perfectly well once you were past the eave line and toward the centre of the building. The usable head clearance at the centre ridge was 7 feet 4 inches. The short walls reduced the surface area exposed to horizontal wind. But she didn't explain this to anyone because they weren't asking. The ridge pole ran 14 feet from end wall to end wall, set 8 feet above the floor on 2 vertical centre posts. From this pole she rafted down to the eave plates on each side at an angle that, by any prior frontier standard, was extravagant. The rafters salvaged 12-foot rail ties trimmed to dimension ran the full slope from ridge to eave without brake or collar tie, because she didn't have enough material for collar ties, and because the steep angle meant the horizontal thrust at the base of each rafter was manageable by the wall plate alone. On top of the rafter skeleton she laid the boards, rough-cut pine, 1 inch thick, running perpendicular to the rafters. Then the first layer of tar paper. Then a second layer of boards running parallel to the rafters to create a batten and board surface that overlapped the joints in the first layer. Then a second layer of tar paper. The double layer was not a planned insulation strategy. It was what she had material to do, having salvaged 2 full rolls of paper from an abandoned claim. The double layer surface had an accidental thermal advantage. The 2 layers of boards and 2 layers of paper created an airspace of roughly 3/4 of an inch. Still, air in a gap conducts heat much less efficiently than solid material. That air gap added the equivalent of about R3 to the roof assembly, bringing the total roof R value to perhaps R5 or R6 thin by modern standards, but meaningfully better than the R1 or R2 roof she'd be sleeping under in the original shanty. The carpenters who walked past shook their heads specifically at the tar paper. They had all seen tar paper pulled clean off a shanty by a hard wind. Why use 2 layers of the same material that failed? What they didn't account for was that tar paper fails on a flat or low-pitched surface because it balloons upward when suction develops above it and pressure builds below it. On a 5-degree slope in a north wind, the paper was pushed against the boards beneath it, not away from them. There was nowhere for it to go but tighter against the surface. She banked sod around the perimeter of the building in mid-November, working on the days when the temperature was above 15 degrees. The sod came from the edge of the field, the dense, root-bound Dakota sod that broke plow blades, compressed into blocks that weighed 40 to 60 pounds each. She cut 200 blocks over 4 days and laid them 2 courses high around 3 sides of the building, leaving the south-facing end wall mostly clear to let light in through 2 of the salvaged windows. The sod berm was 18 to 24 inches thick at its widest point, roughly R3 to R4 of additional insulation at the base, where the wind was coldest and most penetrating. She oriented the building with its long axis running roughly east-west and the steep windward slope facing north-northwest, which was the dominant wind direction in that county through the winter months. She moved in on November 22. Oscar Lindqvist was the first carpenter to say it wouldn't hold. He was not a dishonest man or a stupid one. He had been framing buildings on the prairie since 1878 and had developed an intuition about structures that was empirically grounded in what he'd seen fail and what he'd seen stand. He had built 16 structures in Swede County alone. His own house, a solid, well-framed 2-room shanty with a proper 5/12 gable roof, had survived 3 winters, 2 of them severe. He stopped his wagon on the road past Britta's place on a Tuesday in early December and looked for about 2 minutes before saying anything. "The pitch is all wrong," he said, loud enough to carry across the frozen field to where she was splitting wood near the east wall. "Wind'll get under those eaves and take the whole south slope off. I've seen it happen with a pitch half that steep." She kept splitting wood. "You'll want to come back to town when it gets bad," he added. "Matson's wife will put you up." She didn't answer. He drove on. By the following Sunday he had told the story of the roof at church, and the story had acquired small embellishments by the time it came back to her, that the ridgepole was visibly bowed, that the door faced the wrong direction, that she'd used green wood for the rafters, and they'd warp with the first freeze-thaw. None of this was accurate. What was accurate was the central prediction, which Oscar Lindqvist honestly believed, that the roof would fail in the first serious wind event, and that Britta would need somewhere warm to go when it did. Carl Eklund, another carpenter, this one from Clear Lake, came out to look in mid-December, not because anyone asked him to, but because the account at church had made him curious. He walked around the building twice. He examined the ridge connection and the rafter seats at the eave and the sod berm and the orientation. He was more technical than Lindqvist and more measured in his critique. "The geometry's unusual," he told a group of men at the hardware store in Clear Lake 2 days later. "I don't know where she got the idea. The pitch might actually help with snow load, I'll give her that. But the end walls are too short. Wind gets at the gable ends, you've got nothing to stop it. She'll be cold." He was right that the gable ends were the weakest thermal point. The north gable end, facing the prevailing wind, had only a single layer of boards and 1 layer of tar paper because she'd run out of the second roll of paper before she finished. She'd stuffed newspaper into the gap between the inner and outer boards of that end wall, which helped somewhat, and nailed a piece of canvas she'd found in the outbuilding materials over the inside surface of the north gable. What Carl Eklund didn't consider, because he was thinking about cold air seeping through a gable end wall rather than about wind pressure dynamics, was that a steeply pitched roof redirects the wind over and above the structure before it ever reaches the gable end in full force. On a box shanty, the north wall takes the full force of a north wind. On a steep pitched structure with the ridge running east-west, the north-facing slope is a deflecting surface. It guides the airflow up and over, so the gable ends at the east and west sides see turbulence rather than direct pressure. The worst conditions for the gable ends in Britta's structure would be an east or west wind. The dominant winter wind in Swede County ran northwest to north. She knew none of this terminology. What she knew was the shape of the old Telemark farmhouses, and she had built the shape she remembered, and she thought the wind would go over it the way it went over the hills at home. She was, without knowing the vocabulary, correct. December was cold enough to make the argument seem settled. The temperature in Swede County dropped to -23 on December 14 and held below zero for 11 consecutive days. Britta kept the stove going through the coldest stretches, a cast-iron Acme cook stove, the one good piece she'd moved from the original shanty, and burned wood at a rate that worried her, around 8 to 10 pieces per day in the deepest cold, but was still well under what the neighbours were reporting. The Johansson family to the west, 2 adults, 3 children, the standard 1-2 by 1-6 claim shanty with a 4/12 roof, burned 14 cords of wood through the December cold snap. They were still cold. Their walls allowed so much air infiltration that you could see the flame on the oil lamp waver when the wind gusted, even with all the windows shut. Britta's place had air infiltration problems too, primarily at the south gable end around the windows, where she'd used strips of rabbit skin to fill the gap between the frame and the glass, and they had dried and cracked in the first hard freeze. She spent a morning in late November sealing those gaps with clay mixed with a little straw, the same way she'd seen old stone walls finished in Norway. When it dried, it was tight. Not perfect, tight enough. In early January, the weather turned strange. The temperature rose. Not to spring temperatures, this was still Dakota in January, but it climbed above freezing by January 10. January 11 was 41 degrees. The accumulated snow in the fields softened on top. Men went out without their heaviest coats. The postmaster at Clear Lake told people that a warm spell this late was unusual, maybe a sign of a mild end to winter. Oscar Lindqvist's house was, in early January, somewhat warmer than it had been in December. Standard Dakota shanties benefited from above-freezing conditions because the temperature differential between inside and outside narrowed. When outside was 41 degrees and inside was 60, you almost didn't need a fire at all. On the morning of January 12, Britta walked out to check on the horse and the 2 milk cows she was wintering in the small attached shed she'd built on the south side of the main structure, a lean-to that used the south slope of the main roof as its back wall, adding approximately 12 more feet of covered space for the animals without requiring additional framing. The animals' body heat supplemented the main stove, conducted through the shared wooden wall, not dramatically, maybe 2,000 British thermal units per hour from 2 cows and a horse, but enough to matter on the coldest nights. The sky to the northwest at 8 that morning was a colour she'd never seen in Dakota before. She had seen it in Norway once when she was 9 years old. A yellow-grey light at the horizon, with a greenish cast at the bottom where the sky met the hills. She went back inside and loaded the stove with 6 pieces of wood. She did not go back out. What the Signal Corps forecaster instinct, Paul had correctly identified, was a massive Arctic air mass that had formed over southern Canada around January 8 and was moving southeast at approximately 45 miles per hour across a front 780 miles wide. He had telegraphed a warning. The telegraph lines west of Aberdeen had been down since a storm 2 days prior. The warning never arrived. The cold front hit Swede County at approximately 15 inches the afternoon, based on later accounts. One neighbour, Sven Mattsson, was fixing a fence post 100 yards from his house when the sky to the northwest simply went white, not slowly. Between one moment and the next, the horizon disappeared. He later described it as a wall, not a figure of speech, an actual wall of driven snow and displaced air that moved across the land at the speed of a horse at full gallop. By 2 p.m., the temperature in the county had dropped from 38 degrees to 8 degrees. By 4 p.m., it was -12. By midnight, it reached -31 at the Clear Lake Weather Observers Station and was still falling. The wind hit 60 miles per hour at peak and sustained 45 to 50 miles per hour through the night. At -31, with a 45 mile per hour wind. The effective wind chill using the modern formula that wasn't formalized until the 20th century, but whose effects were entirely real, in 1888 was approximately -65 degrees Fahrenheit. Oscar Lindqvist's shanty, by his own account, written to his brother in Sweden 6 weeks later, dropped to 22 degrees Fahrenheit on the inside by 3 a.m., despite continuous firing of the stove. He burned half a cord of wood through the night. One corner of the roof, the northwest corner, where the wind was worst, developed an audible drumming at peak gusts, where the boards were flexing under uplift load. It did not come off. It held, barely, through the stiffness of the tar paper and the weight of compacted snow that had accumulated before the wind peaked. The Johansson family's stove went cold at midnight when their wood supply ran out. They burned 2 fence rails and the wooden seat from a chair. Their inside temperature reached 14 degrees Fahrenheit. The youngest child, a girl of 4, survived with frostbitten fingers on her left hand. The family was rescued by Sven Mattsson the following afternoon, when the wind finally dropped enough to see 30 feet. The Bergstrom family 3 miles further east, in a slightly better built 2-room frame house, lost their roof on the east-facing lean-to addition at approximately 11 p.m. when the wind shifted briefly to an eastern direction and the lean-to's shallow roof, which had been built as an afterthought with minimal connections, lifted and dropped in 3 pieces. They moved into the main house and piled furniture against the opening. They were cold but alive. Jacob Knutsen, a bachelor homesteader who lived alone a mile south of Britta's place in a dugout, a shelter cut directly into the south face of a rise, with only the front wall exposed above grade, was perfectly warm and burned almost no wood, because a dugout built into a hillside is essentially surrounded by earth at 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and the only surface exposed to the wind is a single south-facing door. This is the geothermal buffering principle at its most direct. He slept through most of the storm. Nobody found this remarkable because they all knew Jakob lived in a hole in the ground and assumed he was simply lucky in his location. The wind hit the north-facing slope of the roof and was deflected upward. The slope factor, at 55 degrees, meant the surface experienced positive pressure. The wind was pressing down against the boards rather than pulling them away. The double layer of boards and paper, already tight against the rafters in the absence of any suction to loosen them, stayed put. Snow accumulated on the windward slope and then slid off once it reached approximately 8 inches of depth, because at 55 degrees, the friction angle of packed snow on a wood surface is exceeded at about that depth, and it releases in slabs. This kept the snow load manageable and meant that each release of accumulated snow added another layer to the sod berm already mounded at the base of the north wall, packing it tighter and higher. By morning, the north berm was 4 feet high and 2 feet wide, an accidental insulation layer that reduced the ground-level wind exposure to almost nothing. The inside temperature, by Britta's account, written in a letter to her brother Torkel, who had by then moved to St. Paul, never dropped below 58 degrees during the night. She burned 6 pieces of wood total. 2 loaded into the stove when she first came in from outside and smelled the weather, 2 more at around 9 p.m. when she could hear the wind building, and 2 more at around 2 a.m. when she woke to check the stove. She was not comfortable. She was worried about the cows, because the lean-to shed on the south side was less well insulated than the main structure, and she could hear the animals moving and calling through the night. She was worried about the horse. She was not worried about the building itself, which she said in the letter was quieter than I expected in such a wind, and did not shake at all in the way the old shanty shook in a heavy fall gale. The stove in the animal lean-to kept enough heat to prevent the animals from suffering serious harm. One cow had a minor case of frostbite on the tips of her ears. The horse was fine. The 2 cows produced milk the following morning, which Britta interpreted as a reliable sign that they hadn't been badly cold a cow under real stress from cold stops producing. She opened the south-facing door at first light, which was around 7:30 a.m., and looked out at what the storm had left behind. The landscape was reorganized. Drifts ran in continuous curves across the fields, wind sculpted into shapes that had no relationship to the property lines or fence posts beneath them. The fence posts were buried. The road was invisible. 3 miles to the northwest she could see, against the white ground and white sky, a thin column of smoke rising from the direction of the Matson house, which meant at least the Matsons had fuel and a working stove. She stood in the door for about 2 minutes. Then she put her coat on, took a shovel, and started digging. It took her 4 hours to reach the Johansson family. The snow was 3 feet deep on the level and 6 to 7 feet in the drifts. She had Henrik's Norwegian snowshoes, wide ash frames with leather webbing, old enough that the webbing was grey and cracked at the edges, but still serviceable, and she moved across the surface of the drifts rather than through them when she could. When she couldn't, she shovelled. She found the Johansson house by the chimney, which projected about 8 inches above the surrounding snowdrift. She shovelled down to the door, which was on the south side of the building, and knocked. Erik Johansson opened it. He was wearing his coat and a blanket, and his wife's scarf around his hands. The inside of the house was 14 degrees. The youngest children were in the bed in the back corner with every piece of fabric in the house piled on top of them. The oldest child, a boy of 11, was awake and feeding small pieces of a broken chair leg into the stove. Britta had brought a pot of cooked porridge wrapped in her second blanket and a piece of sacking. She had also brought a coal bucket with 8 pieces of split firewood in it, because she knew they'd burned everything they had. She handed the firewood through the door. She did not stay. The Johansson family needed heat more than they needed company, and she had 2 other houses to check. Sven Matsson's house she could see smoke from, so she went to the Bergstrom place next, where she found them cold but operational. They had managed to stay warm enough through the night, despite losing the lean-to roof, and now that the wind was down, they were functional. She told them about the Johanssons. Sven Matsson, who was already out clearing his approach road, took a sled of wood to the Johanssons that afternoon. When Oskar Lindqvist came past the following day, driving his wagon slowly along what had been the road before the storm buried it, checking on his neighbours the way men did, after a hard winter event, he looked at Britta's place for a long time before he got down from the wagon. The structure was standing, obviously. More than standing, it looked essentially unchanged from before the storm. The north berm was higher. There was a clean, sharp shedding line of settled snow at the base of the north slope where load had slid off during the night. The south slope, the leeward side, had a thicker accumulation, maybe 14 inches, that had drifted in from the northeast as the wind began to turn, but the roof itself was sound on both sides. Oskar Lindqvist stood in the cold for several minutes, looking at the angles. He didn't go to the door. He climbed back onto his wagon and drove on. He told Carl Eklund about it that Thursday in Clear Lake. Carl listened carefully, and then asked what angle he thought the pitch was, and Oskar said he thought it was close to 60 degrees. And Carl said that was steeper than anything he'd ever framed, and Oskar said yes. Neither of them said the thing that was obvious from the physics, which was that they had been wrong about why steep roofs were dangerous on the prairie, and right only about why they were impractical, too much lumber, too much height, too unconventional, but wrong about the structural and thermal consequences in a storm of that severity. What they eventually said, between themselves, was that she was lucky with the orientation, that the wind had happened to come from the right direction to work with her particular design rather than against it. That an east wind would have been a different story. This was not entirely wrong. An east or west wind would have hit the gable ends rather than the slopes, and the gable ends were the weakest thermal point. Whether they would have failed in the same way a low-pitched roof fails in a north wind is an open question. The gable ends didn't have the same uplift dynamic because they were vertical rather than nearly horizontal, and vertical surfaces don't experience the same suction-driven uplift as horizontal ones, but they would have been colder, certainly. The dominant winter wind in Swede County, Dakota Territory, was northwest to north. The Carpenter's analysis was technically defensible. The design was optimized for the predominant threat, but it required admitting that she had correctly identified the predominant threat and designed for it, which was more than most settlers did deliberately. Britta Voss did not rebuild the structure after the following spring. Not because it failed, it didn't, but because she added on to it. She extended the east gable end by 12 feet, giving herself a longer ridge line and more interior space, and reinforced the north-facing slope with a layer of split cedar shakes she ordered through the hardware store at Clear Lake, which added another R2 to the roof assembly and gave it a more permanent, less improvised appearance. When Carl Eklund saw the expanded version that summer, he stopped his wagon and spent about 20 minutes walking around it before saying, slowly, that the cedar shakes were a good decision for longevity. He did not say it was a good building. He did say the shakes were a good decision. It was the closest any of the Carpenters came to reconsidering. The building survived until 1914, when Britta's nephew purchased the property and tore the structure down to build a proper 2-story frame farmhouse in its place. The nephew, her brother, Torkel's oldest son, Lars, who had grown up in St. Paul and studied at the State Agricultural College, was somewhat embarrassed by the old triangular building and didn't fully understand why his aunt had been so attached to it. He did keep the ridgepole. He said it was the straightest piece of salvaged timber he'd ever seen and too good to burn. The storm of the 12th of January 1888 is recorded in the historical literature as the schoolhouse blizzard, named for the number of children caught in schoolhouses and on the paths between schoolhouses and home when the temperature dropped 18 degrees in 3 minutes. The death toll of 235 across Dakota Territory and Nebraska represents only those deaths that could be confirmed and attributed to the storm in the days and weeks following. Later scholarship suggests the actual toll was higher. What the storm exposed, with the finality of a test that could not be rescheduled, was the gap between the building instincts of the frontier and the actual physics of what wind does to roofs of different shapes. Settlers and carpenters on the Dakota prairie had spent 20 years developing rules of thumb that were built from experience. Keep the profile low, this was correct in the sense that a lower frontal area presents less resistance to wind. Face the front away from the prevailing wind, this was reasonable as a way to protect the door and windows from direct blast. Use the cheapest available materials, this was economically necessary and structurally defensible in mild conditions. Bank sod around the base, this was the most important single thing settlers did for warmth, and the carpenters who recommended it were giving genuinely good advice. What none of those rules captured was the distinction between wind resistance and wind behavior at different angles. A low-pitched roof resists less wind in the sense of presenting a smaller target. It also converts that wind into maximum uplift force on the roof surface. A steep-pitched roof presents a larger frontal target, but converts the wind's energy into downward pressure on the windward slope. The distinction is not obvious without calculation or wind tunnel testing, neither of which was available to a Dakota Territory carpenter in 1887. The physics Britta stumbled into by way of a 15-year-old memory of Norwegian farmhouses in a mountain valley is the same physics that now underlies modern steep roof design for high wind zones. The 2022 ASCE 7 standard, the document that governs structural design across American construction, assigns positive pressure to windward slopes above 25 degrees and peaks the stabilizing benefit in the range of 45 to 60 degrees. Ski lodges in avalanche country are built steep for exactly this reason. Hurricane-resistant construction in the Gulf Coast uses hip roofs with angles chosen specifically to reduce uplift forces. The optimal angle varies by wind speed and building geometry, but the principle is the same one, a Norwegian widow calculated by feel on a Dakota quarter section in the fall of 1887. The snow shedding and heat loss advantages are also not forgotten. The passive house movement that began in Germany in the 1990s treats surface area to volume ratio as one of the primary levers in energy efficiency design. The tighter the shape, the more sphere-like. With minimum surface relative to enclosed volume, the less heat it loses. An A-frame or steep gable structure approaches this ideal more closely than a box with a flat roof. What Scandinavian architects formalized as a principle in the late 20th century was what Scandinavian immigrants on the American frontier were carrying in memory from buildings their grandparents had inhabited. The irony of the schoolhouse blizzard is not simply that it killed people. Blizzards kill people. The irony is that many of the deaths were preventable by construction methods that were already known in the cultures that provided most of the settlers, Norwegian, Swedish, German, Russian, and were simply abandoned in the rush to build cheap and fast on the American model. The steeply pitched Norwegian stabber, the massive clay-walled German Volga farmhouse, the earth-bermed dugout that Jakob Knutsen slept through the storm in, all of these were functional cold climate designs that had been tested over generations. The flat-roofed, thin-walled claim shanty that everyone agreed was the correct approach was, from a physics standpoint, the least capable structure most of those settlers had ever lived in. Nobody planned this badly. They built what they could afford, what they could build quickly, what the available materials permitted, what the pattern books showed. They were not fools. They were people working with limited resources under severe time pressure, in an environment they didn't yet fully understand. The one person in Swede County who built something different wasn't smarter than the Carpenters. She was Norwegian enough to remember what steep roofs looked like, grieving enough to make decisions without asking permission, and stubborn enough to keep building when the Carpenters shook their heads and drove away. The roof pitch that Britta chose, 55 to 60 degrees, steep enough that a person couldn't stand on it without rope, is not practical for most residential construction. The lumber requirements are substantial. The interior geometry creates triangular dead zones near the eaves that limit furniture placement and usable floor area. Access to the ridge for repairs is challenging. The design serves extreme cold climates and specific orientations well, and is less versatile than a moderate pitch gable with proper insulation. What remains practical, and has been validated by 130 years of engineering research since that storm, is the underlying principle. The angle of a roof surface relative to wind direction is not merely a structural question. It's a thermodynamic one. The same wind that strips heat from a building by forcing cold air through gaps and driving down the R effective value of thin walls also determines whether a roof acts as a sail pulling the building apart or a wedge pressing it together. Settlers understood this intuitively in one direction. They knew high winds could take a roof off. They didn't understand it in the other direction. They didn't know that steeper slopes change the wind's effect from destructive to stabilizing. Britta Voss understood it in neither direction. She just remembered what her grandmother's farmhouse looked like in a January storm and built something similar, and when the coldest night in a decade arrived, her stove burned 6 pieces of wood, and her walls held 61 degrees, while her neighbors piled blankets on their children and burned their furniture. That's the story. 6 pieces of wood, 61 degrees. Every carpenter was right that her building looked wrong. They just weren't right about what the wind would think of it. Margaret Barr Roberts, the Irish immigrant widow who held her claim alone in the Badlands through the winter of 1886 to 87, after her husband disappeared, the same big die-up winter that destroyed Theodore Roosevelt's cattle herds, and ended. The open-range era is documented by the Theodore Roosevelt Center as surviving that winter through practical self-sufficiency, selling produce, taking in laundry, keeping her daughters fed through the worst conditions the northern plains had seen in living memory. She did not build an unusual shelter. She survived through the same combination of stubbornness, practical skill, and refusal to concede that most frontier women brought to every impossible situation. The Chrisman sisters Hattie, Lizzie, Lutie, and Ruth, homesteading in Custer County. Nebraska, in 1886, remembered the 1888 blizzard as the morning their schoolhouse lost its roof in the first hour of the storm, and the teacher led them out into it. They survived because they walked with the wind rather than across it, and because the neighbor they reached had a working stove and enough wood. The roof on that schoolhouse was sod over a shallow pitched frame, exactly what the standard called for, exactly what everyone agreed was appropriate. Minnie Freeman tied her 13 students together with twine and walked them through the storm when that roof came off. They all survived. She became, in the months following, a figure of considerable public attention, received more than 80 marriage proposals, according to the Omaha newspapers. The students she saved were alive because she was resourceful and brave and tied them together so they couldn't drift apart in the whiteout. They would not have needed to be tied together if the schoolhouse roof had stayed on. The roof did not stay on because it was built the way everyone agreed a roof should be built on the Dakota prairie in 1887. That's the thing about the right way to do something. Sometimes the right way is right because it works most of the time, and the one time it doesn't, the test arrives all at once, at 45 miles per hour, at negative 31 degrees, and you find out everything the rule of thumb couldn't tell you. Britta Voss filed her homestead proof in April of 1888. The paperwork, processed at the land office in Watertown, listed her as the sole claimant on the quarter section, noted that she had maintained continuous residence for the required period, and recorded the presence of a dwelling, cultivated acres, and outbuildings sufficient to satisfy the Homestead Act requirements. The dwelling was described in the sworn affidavit as a one-story frame structure with steep gabled roof, approximate dimensions 14 feet by 22 feet, with attached animal shed. In sound condition. In sound condition. After the winter of 1888, after the schoolhouse blizzard, she lived in that house for another 11 years, through 7 more Dakota winters, 3 of them severe. She eventually remarried a widower named Anders Lindahl, who had a claim 4 miles to the east and who had the good sense, when he first came to call and stood outside looking at the building she'd built, to say nothing at all about the roof. He moved into the house rather than the other way around. The addition they built together in 1894 used the same 5.5-degree pitch as the original, because by then Britta had a strong opinion about what worked, and Anders had seen the evidence with his own eyes. Oscar Lindquist built a tool shed in 1891 with a steeper pitch than any structure he'd previously framed. He told the man he was building it for that the higher pitch would be better for snow load. He didn't mention anything else. Carl Eklund's records don't show any change in his standard roof pitches. He was, until he retired in 1903, building shanties and farmhouses at 4/12 and 5/12, the way the book said to do it. His work held up well enough. Most winters, that was sufficient. Most winters. There is a thing that physics and history agree on, which is that structures get tested when conditions exceed the design assumptions. A claim shanty built to handle a normal Dakota winter might stand for 30 years before a storm reveals what it couldn't handle. A school roof built for average snow load survives until the winter that averages don't cover. The fact that something has worked before is not proof that it will work under conditions outside its original parameters. What Britta Voss built was not ahead of its time in any grand sense. It was a structure built by a woman who had fewer resources than her neighbours, no professional advice she found useful, a memory of buildings from a place with harder winters than the Dakota prairie, and the logical conclusion that if the old way wasn't going to keep her warm, she needed to try a different shape. The different shape worked because of physics she couldn't have named, implementing principles she'd never studied, solving a problem the Carpenters had identified by exactly the wrong solution. The Carpenters were right about almost everything, that the building looked strange, that the lumber requirements were excessive, that the short walls were unconventional, that a different wind direction could have tested it differently. They were right about all the things that are easy to see and wrong about the one thing that mattered on the 12th of January 1888, which was what the wind would do to that particular shape on the particular night when the temperature dropped 18 degrees in 3 minutes and 60 miles per hour came from the north. 6 pieces of wood, 61 degrees. The storm proved everything she'd built and everything they'd doubted on the same night, in the same county, at the same wind speed. The evidence doesn't get more direct than that. The Carpenters moved on, Britta stayed. The cedar shakes, she added, to the north slope in the summer of 1888 lasted until the building was torn down in 1914, the year Lars Voss arrived from St. Paul to build something that looked like what everyone agreed a house should look like. He kept the ridgepole. It was the straightest piece of timber he'd ever seen.